1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's the 10 dual commandments. It's the 10 dual commandments. Number 1.
The challenge, demand satisfaction. If they apologize, no need for further action.
Number 2.
If they don't, grab a friend, that's your second, your lieutenant, when there's reckoning to be reckoned.
Number 3.
Have your seconds meet face to face,
Negotiate a peace.
or negotiate a time and place.
This is commonplace, especially between recruits.
Moore's dispute dies and no one shoots.
Number 4.
If they don't reach a peace, that's alright. Time to get some pencils and a doctor on set. You pay him in advance, you treat him with civility, you have him turn around so he can have deniability.
5.
Duel before the sun is in the sky. Take a place to die where it's high and dry.
Number 6.
Leave a note for your next kin.
Tell him where you've been.
Pray that hell or heaven lets you in.
7.
The message says, ready for the moment of adrenaline. When you finally face your opponent.
Number 8.
Last chance to negotiate. Stand in your second seat and take consecutive record. Alexander.
Aaron Burr, sir, can we agree that duels are dumb and immature?
Sure, but your man has to answer for his words, Burr.
With his life, we both know that's absurd, sir. Okay, how many men died because Lee was inexperienced in rules? Okay, so we're doing this.
Number 9.
Look him in the eye, aim no higher. Summon all the courage you require. Then
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Number 10. Paces fire.
Yeah, I always start off most of my lectures with a chorus line. The history itself can be told in a rather brief manner. In the early morning of July 11th, 1804, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton each took separate rowboats to a secluded spot next to Weehawken, New Jersey. And there, according to the code Duello, that is the dueling code, they faced off and exchanged fire. Hamilton died as a result of that fire. Burr, although he was uninjured, suffered irreparable harm to his political reputation. But of course, that's more or less the short story. There's much more to it. And today what I want to do is I want to talk about how this particular fatal duel came about, how it was carried out, and perhaps get a little bit into the repercussions of that duel. Both men that morning had some similarities. Both were practiced politicians. Both were Revolutionary War heroes. Burr had distinguished himself during the American invasion of Quebec during the Revolutionary War. Hamilton had been the first officer over the parapets during the siege of Yorktown, or during the Battle of Yorktown. They were both, even for their age, relatively small in stature. Burr was 5'6", Hamilton was 5'7". They were both in their late 40s, so on and so forth. But here the similarities more or less end. Aaron Burr was an aristocrat. If you could say at that time that America really had an aristocracy, his grandfather was the famous Jonathan Edwards, sinners at the hands of an angry God, Jonathan Edwards. He more or less lived with the code that a gentleman could do what he wanted as long as he did it with style. He was taciturn, a little morose. He had, I would say, or somebody else said, he had all his Puritan energy coiled up, ready to strike. I'm fighting dry mouth here. Hamilton, on the other hand, was rather flamboyant, outgoing. He came from the opposite world of Aaron Burr. He was born on the small island of St. Nevis in the Caribbean. To very poor parents. John Adams once said that he was the bastard brat of a Scottish peddler. His mother was a down-and-out beauty who was from French extraction. His father was a Scotch merchant who had a gift for bankruptcy. But due to his brilliance, he left St. Nevis, which was too small of a venue for him pretty early on in his life. As a young man, he came to the colonies, and there his brilliance shone. During the Revolutionary War, he became George Washington aide-de-camp, his aide. During the Continental Congress or Continental Convention, he was a delegate and a driving force in the ratification of our Constitution. In 1789, Washington appointed him our first Secretary of Treasury, and he cajoled Congress into paying off its Revolutionary War debts, and pretty much set this nation on a solid financial course. So there were similarities and differences, but the big thing was that both men hated each other. The spark that set off the duel was actually an article that appeared in the Albany Register in June of 1804. One Mr. Dr. Cooper wrote an article in which he said that at a rally that Hamilton had harangued Mr. Burr. And then he ended the article by saying, and he went on to say other despicable things. The same word that got Hillary Clinton in trouble, by the way, during the last election. Burr, who was itching for a fight, wrote Hamilton a letter asking him to explain what he meant by the word despicable. Now, at that point, Hamilton could have gotten out of any trouble by just, writing back that, he didn't remember saying despicable, that, he apologized if the article caused Burr any kind of upset, and then Burr would have had to drop the matter. However, Hamilton didn't do that. What Hamilton did was he wrote Burr a letter back saying, well, it started off by correcting Burr's grammar and syntax. My English students would know that. A ploy likely to really have irked Burr. And then he went on to say, how could I know what despicable meant in that context? Over the past 15 years, you've done and said plenty of despicable things. And indeed, he thought he had. Now, we go back to 1790. Burr had contested Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law for a Senate race in New York, and he had acted so despicably that Alexander said that he was detestable and that he was no better than a political opportunist. Then came the elections of 1796 and the election of 1800. Now I'm going to get a little into the weeds here. I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible and not try to get too complicated. But at that time, we had two political parties. We had the Federalists, headed up by John Adams and Hamilton. The Federalists believed in a strong central government. And we had the Democratic Republicans, headed up by Thomas Jefferson and in part by Aaron Burr. They believed in a decentralized government, and they believed in state rights, more or less. So, in the election of 1796, the big thing was that the Federalists accused the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson in supporting the French. The French at that time were sending people to the guillotine. It didn't look like, and Jefferson was strongly associated with the French, and it just didn't look good. By contrast, the Democratic Republicans accused the Federalists of supporting the hated British, whom we had just cast out. But so there was that, but there was also the fact that Hamilton had sent out a lot of vitriolic about Aaron Burr, who was a Federalist, and that tipped the scales so that the Federalists won. Then, excuse me again. Then in 1800, Aaron Burr came to the convention and passed around information that John Adams, head of the Federalist Party, and Hamilton were fighting with each other. This split the Federalists such that the Democratic Republicans won. But both Jefferson and Aaron Burr had received the same number of electoral votes. So the election went to the House of Representatives. Now, I know I'm getting into the weeds here. And for 35 separate votes, there was a tie until the Federalists under Hamilton, a small group of Federalists under Hamilton said, look, we're not going to win. Let's throw our votes to Jefferson because, well, they're both evil, but Thomas Jefferson is less evil than Aaron Burr. So, according to the rules of election at that time, Jefferson became president and Alexander Hamilton became vice president. Well, Aaron Burr became vice president. Thank you for the correction. Now, it's not the end of that. Aaron Burr then ticked off Jefferson, who pretty much excluded him from his office, kind of sent him into the wilderness. And so Aaron Burr was left with nothing to do. Then in 1804, a gubernatorial election came up in the state of New York, a federal bastion. So, I know this is complicated. So, at that point, Aaron Burr decided that he got religion and decided he was a Federalist. So he went and he campaigned, but Hamilton did everything he could to prevent his election, and indeed he lost the nomination for the Federalist to be the Federalist candidate. And then he tried to run as an independent, and he lost. Now, in those days, when you lost an election, that was a personal affront. So Burr was lying in wait, just waiting for an opportunity to get back at Hamilton. So when this came up, he had his chance. Turn it. Somehow it's not working. Oh, there it goes. So number 2, grab your friend. That's your second. So both men, Hamilton and Burr, had close friends who would eventually serve as seconds in the duel. Aaron Burr had a friend by the name of Van Ness. Hamilton had a friend by the name of Nathaniel Pendleton. So all this time, their letters, they started a bunch of letters going back and forth, and they kept getting, hotter and hotter under the collar. But they didn't send the letters through a post office. They sent the letters via their seconds or their friends. Eventually, there came a time where Burr sent Hamilton the following: Colonel Burr requires a general disavowal of any intention on the part of General Hamilton in his various conversations to convey impressions derogatory to the honor of Mr. Burr. That's the way they spoke back then. Basically, he was saying, I want to meet you in a duel. Okay, because it had gone from a single instance, the single article in the paper, to a long-lasting personal grudge, and he had to defend his honor. Next one. For some reason, my thing isn't working. Okay, number 3, have your seconds meet face-to-face, negotiate a peace or negotiate a time and place. This is commonplace, especially between recruits. Most disputes die and no one shoots. When they decided to start the duel, they had to follow something called the Code Duello. Now, people had been having duels for a long time, but in the 1700s, whereas before people had been fighting duels with swords, with a sword, you can inflict, a pretty specific wound. In fact, Austrian army officers before World War I used to have what are known as dueling scars, kind of a mark of honor. But you could be pretty specific. But in the 1700s, they began using pistols. And with pistols, you didn't quite know, what the results were going to be. And so consequently, a lot of people began to die in these duels rather than just being wounded. So a group of people, Irishmen in fact, in 1777 got together and they set up the Code Duello, which really consisted of not 10 duel commandments, but 26 separate commandments that people had to follow during a duel. These rules had to do with how you challenged, how you challenged somebody to a duel, how many shots you could have, how many wounds you could suffer before a person's personal honor was upheld. See, the point of a duel was not to kill your enemy. The point of a duel was to defend your honor. Most disputes die and no one shoots. Well, in fact, both Burr and Hamilton had been in duels. In fact, Hamilton had been in 10 duels, but they were non-shooting duels. Burr had also been in shooting duels. So it was possible that they could come to the point where people would shoot at each other. Okay, if they don't reach a peace, it's all right, time to get some pistols and a doctor on site. Okay, so because, according to these rules, these 26 rules, Hamilton was able to choose the weapons that he wanted to use. So he chose these handcrafted dueling pistols that his brother-in-law owned. Now, these dueling pistols were smooth bore. That meant that they weren't very accurate. The bullet would not go out of the barrel in an accurate way. But the ball that was used was a 1-ounce ball, 0.58 in diameter, and it could create a 2-inch wound. So you had a weapon that, while not very accurate, could be pretty lethal. There were a couple of other things with regard to this pistol. This pistol had been used in a previous duel where John Church, the owner of the pistols, had actually shot a button off of Aaron Burr's coat. They'd also been used in a duel where Hamilton's son Philip had been killed. So they had quite a thing behind them. Oh, there was one other thing. There was a secret mechanism on the pistol that was a hair trigger. If you use the hair trigger, you only needed 1 pound of pressure to set off the trigger. If you didn't use it, you needed 20 pounds of finger pressure. And only Hamilton knew that this mechanism existed. Hamilton was also able to choose his doctor, one David Hossack, and pay him in advance, and have him turn around so he can have deniability. Dueling, in spite of all the different rules that applied to it, was illegal. It was still against the law. So, but gentlemen still did it. So what you had to do is you had to keep it as secret as possible. So the people who rode Hamilton and Burr over, they couldn't watch the duel. The doctor couldn't watch the duel. In fact, the duel was not called a duel. It was called an interview. Imagine showing up nowadays to an interview with a couple of pistolets. You probably wouldn't go very far, okay? Or you'd go to jail. So everything was set up so you could have deniability. Number 5, duel before the sun is in the sky. Pick a place to die where it's high and dry. Most duels were fought at sunrise for a number of reasons. One, there was less likely to be sun in the duelist's eye at sunrise, and also it would be dark, so people couldn't, or semi-dark, so people couldn't see what was going on, especially law enforcement people. You didn't want them to see. So most duels took place at sunset. Pick a place to die where it's high and dry. Well, they didn't really pick a place that was high and dry. They picked a small sliver of land close that on the side of the river, about 40 feet by 10 feet wide. To get to Weehawken, New Jersey, you had to actually climb a cliff of about 150 feet. So they really didn't have it in Weehawken, New Jersey. But they picked this piece of land because it had a north-south axis, and so they wouldn't get, neither duelist would have the sun in his eye at that time. Number 6, leave a note for your next of kin. Tell them where you've been. Pray that heaven, hell, or heaven lets you in. We know that before the night of the duel that Alexander Hamilton set down, he wrote out his will. And he also said that he thought that dueling was sinful, but that he was forced to do it anyway. And he said that he actually had no intention of shooting Burr in the duel. He actually wrote that down. Pray that heaven and hell let you in. Number 7, confess your sins, ready for the moment of adrenaline when you finally face your opponent. We don't know what Burr was thinking or doing, or if he was praying the night before. The only thing we do know was that he slept on his couch in his study and that he wore a silk-like suit. Number 7, your last chance to negotiate, send in your second, see if they can set the record straight. Well, both men left their homes in Manhattan early in the morning and crossed the Hudson River. Burr had one oarsman with him, and Van Ness his second. Hamilton came in a separate boat with 2 oarsmen, his second, Nathaniel Pendleton, and the doctor. Wait 1 second here. Aaron Burr's company actually arrived earlier, the earliest, because they had to kind of prepare the ground, so they cleared away the brush and made everything ready for the duel. And then, just before the duel began, they met, discussed the rules. The rules were as follows, okay? They would be standing at 10 paces, and as soon as Pendleton, Hamilton's second, said present, they would fire their guns. If the first shot went out, then the second person to make the shot had 3 seconds to make the second shot. His lieutenant would say 1, 2, 3, and then the second shot could be fired. But if it wasn't fired within those 3 seconds, the duel was off. Okay? After the shots were fired, then they could meet again and decide if each person's honor had been fulfilled, and usually it was, but it's theoretically possible that they could have repeated the thing. So they both went back, both of the duelists went back to their respective corners, and at that moment, Pendleton whispers to Hamilton, "Do you want me to set the hair trigger?" Hamilton says no. So, they're ready to go. Pendleton says, present. 2 shots rang out, one after the next. The first shot went high was shot by Hamilton, went high over Burr's head. Shortly after, Burr lowered his gun and shot Hamilton. Now, whether or not he intended to hit Hamilton or merely graze him, Nobody knows. But what happened is that the bullet entered about 4 inches up from the hip, ricocheted off the chest, went through the liver and the diaphragm, and lodged in the second lumbar vertebrae. Hossack, the doctor, immediately ran over to Hamilton, and while he was in Hossack's arms, Hamilton said, "It is mortal, sir." So Hamilton knew at that very last minute that he was a goner. At the same time, at first, Burr kind of wanted to go toward Hamilton, but then his second, Van Ness, unfolded an umbrella to guard Burr from the others having to see him. And they ran toward the boat. Right about the time they reached the boat, Burr said that he wanted to go back, but Van Ness said, "No, get in the boat," and they left. They carried Hamilton back to the boat, and they began crossing the river. About halfway across, Hamilton, who had been unconscious, regained consciousness, and at that moment he said, "I had no intention of shooting Burr." And then he also said something that was a little bit strange, and that was, "Do you know that the gun is still loaded?" Well, that might have been because he was delirious and hadn't realized that he had actually shot off the gun. Okay, so Hamilton went back to his house, or they carried him back to his house, and then about 2 o'clock, 2 p.m. the next day, he expired, surrounded by the Episcopal Bishop of New York, his doctor Hossack, his wife Elizabeth, and their 7 children. What followed was a grand funeral. Everybody who was anybody in New York turned out, as well as common people. However, the reaction was just the opposite for Burr. Most of the newspapers in New York at that time were Federalist newspapers, and so they began to write all these kinds of stories about Burr, saying that during the time of the funeral, he and his friends were in the Tav, making toast to the death of Hamilton. There was also one rumor that he had actually worn some kind of suit coat that prevented the bullet from entering. There was even one scurrilous rumor that his friends had hidden in the bushes and had shot Hamilton. So all these rumors circulated to the point where Burr actually had to flee. He fled to Georgia, and from there he fled to the territory beyond the Mississippi. Okay. So what are we to make of all of this? Well, obviously, the nation lost one of its founding fathers in Hamilton, and obviously Burr's reputation was ruined forever. But I think there's something beyond this, because this was really the only clear example of violence that occurred, this kind of violence that occurred in this new republic of ours. If you look at other countries that have revolutions, like the French Revolution, revolutions have a way of eating their young. So the French Revolution disintegrated into, the guillotine. You have the Russian Revolution, a lot of bloodletting there. The Chinese Revolution, a lot of bloodletting there. The revolutions in the 1960s with the Africans in the newly minted African nations, a lot of bloodletting there. But we were largely spared of that. Democracy is a rough and tumble business. People are passionate about their ideas. And it's easy for the verbal to go to the physical and for the ideal to go to, or for the verbal to go to the physical and for the idea to go to the personal. We largely escaped that, and we needed to take that into consideration in these passionate times. Okay, that's my lecture. I'd like to really thank the 10 Dual Commandment Ensemble. Could you guys stand up and take a bow? We have a few minutes. Are there? Thank you. Do we have a few questions from the audience? I did forget to mention one thing in the course. I probably forgot to mention a lot of things during the course of my lecture. But just before, one thing, a key thing that I left out was the fact that just before the guns were fired, Hamilton took out a pair of spectacles and put them on. In fact, I didn't even show that. You can see where his spectacles are on here. And then he kind of drew a bead with his gun as if he was going to shoot the gun. So again, although we have these stories, we really don't know what the people's intentions or motivations were. There are a lot of contradictions. Yes?
Thanks for doing this, and I thought it was really great. Dave, I have a question kind of on what you're talking about right now. Is there any, so Hamilton kind of shot the gun up, so maybe he didn't mean to shoot at Burr.
Mm-hmm.
Any evidence or anything that you've come across, do historians or do anyone think that there was any suicidal impulse in Hamilton, that he was kind of allowing himself to just be shot? Is there any evidence of that, or we just don't know?
I don't, from all that I've read, and I would say not. There was nothing in Alexander Hamilton's history to indicate that he was despondent or that he didn't have a lust for life. I mean, this is a guy who, if you know, that's all he wanted to do. He wanted to be active. He wanted to do things. You know, he had surmounted a lot of obstacles in his life. He wasn't. I don't think he was the type who really wanted to commit suicide.
So do you think Burr would just miss, or wouldn't shoot at him?
It's just my theory. I think he assumed that although Burr was in his mind detestable, that Burr was also a gentleman, and that Burr would have acted the way he acted. Other questions? Come on, students, no? Okay, well, thank you very much.